That rainy night, Seraphina Vale signed the divorce papers with trembling hands, not from fear, but because she knew she had just lost everything. Her husband, Damian Mercer, stood before the television cameras with a triumphant smile, accusing her of betrayal, theft, and ruining his empire. The crowd believed him. The entire city of Blackthorn believed him. In a single night, she went from a powerful lady to an outcast on the cold, rainy streets. But that night, the door of a mysterious black car opened, and inside was the man whose name the entire city trembled at the mere mention of. If you're watching this story, please like and comment with the name of the city you're watching in, so I know how far my story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will keep you glued to the screen. The rain had no mercy that night. It came down in sheets, the kind that didn't just soak clothes but pressed against a person's skin like cold hands trying to hold them under. The courthouse steps of Blackthorn City's Superior Court glistened under floodlights, and every journalist in the city had shown up to watch the spectacle. Camera flashes strobed in the dark like a dying electrical circuit. Microphones were shoved toward anyone willing to speak. And in the center of it all, behind a polished mahogany table inside the glass-walled hearing room visible from the street, Seraphina Vale sat with her spine rigid and her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was 31 years old. She had a law degree she'd never used because Damian said it made her seem aggressive at dinner parties. She had a talent for the piano she'd abandoned because the practice schedule interfered with his social calendar. She had laugh lines around her eyes that had stopped forming somewhere around the third year of her marriage when she'd run out of things to laugh about. None of that was visible to the cameras. What they captured was a woman in a dove-gray dress with dark circles barely covered by concealer, sitting across from her husband of 4 years while his legal team laid out accusations that made her stomach clench so hard she thought she might fold in half. Damian Mercer sat on the opposite side of the table like he'd been carved there. Charcoal suit, silver cufflinks, hair combed with the kind of precision that took 40 minutes and a personal stylist. He hadn't looked at her once since the proceedings began, which told her more than any legal document could. He wasn't avoiding her eyes out of guilt. He simply didn't consider her worth looking at anymore. His lead attorney, a bone-dry woman named Harriet Solis, slid a manila folder across the polished surface. Mrs. Mercer, the evidence compiled here demonstrates a pattern of financial misconduct and deliberate sabotage against Mercer Industries beginning in approximately. Those accounts were opened in my name without my knowledge. Seraphina's voice came out steadier than she felt. She'd rehearsed that sentence at 3 a.m. for 2 weeks running. Harriet didn't even pause. The signatures are yours. They're forged. Our handwriting expert, your handwriting expert is on your payroll. A murmur from the assembled observers. Damian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, which meant she'd landed a point. Small victory, the kind that costs you the war. Her own attorney, a man named George Pell, who'd been recommended by Damian's own business manager 6 months ago, which she now understood to be a catastrophic mistake, leaned toward her and whispered, "Seraphina, it's better to—" "Don't!" She moved her arm away from his hand. "Don't tell me what's better." Pell sat back. He didn't argue. That alone told her where his loyalties lived. The proceedings took another 40 minutes. It felt like 6 hours. Harriet Solis laid out each accusation with the clinical efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. Unauthorized wire transfers totaling $4.7 million. Documents leaked to a competitor during contract negotiations. A pattern of reckless personal spending from joint accounts. The numbers were real. She recognized the account numbers, the transaction dates. But she hadn't made those transactions. She'd noticed unusual activity months ago and asked Damian about it directly. He'd kissed her forehead and told her she was tired. He'd been moving money and building a paper trail with her name on it for at least 18 months, maybe longer. The final document Harriet placed on the table was the divorce petition itself, already signed by Damian. His signature was large and unhurried, the signature of a man who'd been looking forward to this moment. Seraphina stared at the blank line, waiting for her name. "You don't have to sign tonight," Pell said, very quietly. "If she doesn't sign," Harriet said, turning a single page in her folder without looking up, "we proceed with the criminal fraud referral to the Federal Financial Crimes Division by end of business tomorrow." There it was. Sign and walk away with nothing, or refuse and face prosecution for crimes someone else had committed using her identity. With Pell as her attorney, with the evidence stacked the way it had been stacked, she wouldn't survive a federal case. Damien knew that. He designed the whole thing to make sure she knew it too. Seraphina picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. She was proud of that, and ashamed of being proud of something so small. She pressed the nib to paper and signed her name in full, the same signature she'd used since she was 18 years old, clean and slightly forward-leaning. Then she set the pen down on the table, squared the document back toward Harriet Solace, and stood. Damien finally looked at her. He was almost smiling. Not quite. Just the ghost of satisfaction sitting in the corners of his mouth. The kind of expression a man wears when a long project has finally concluded. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to make it deliberate. Then she looked away, walked toward the door, and didn't turn back. The flashbulbs hit her the moment she stepped outside. Reporters surged against the temporary barriers the courthouse security had set up, shouting her name over each other. Someone shoved a microphone directly into her face from 6 inches away. The rain plastered her hair against her neck within seconds. "Seraphina, did you really steal from Mercer Industries? Is it true the accounts total nearly $5 million? Mrs. Mercer, sorry, Ms. Vale, do you have a statement?" She kept walking, eyes forward, shoulders back, the way her mother had taught her to walk through rooms full of people who didn't want her there. It wasn't dignity, exactly. It was something uglier and more functional than dignity. It was survival posture. Behind her, she heard the doors open again, and the crowd noise swelled to a different pitch, the sound of people shifting toward someone they actually wanted to see. She didn't have to turn around to know Damien had stepped out. She heard his voice carry over the rain with the practiced ease of a man comfortable with microphones. "I'm deeply saddened by what's come to light," he said. "My priority now is protecting what my family built. I wish Seraphina well." She made it down 7 steps before her knees nearly gave. She caught herself on the railing, gripped it hard enough to feel the cold iron dig into her palm. The pain helped. She breathed through her nose, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way the therapist she'd stopped seeing 2 years ago had taught her. Then she straightened, let go of the railing, and kept moving. She had nowhere to go. That was the full reality of her situation, arriving at her in pieces over the next 2 hours as she walked through rain that didn't let up. Her phone had service, but no signal from anyone who mattered. Her closest friend, Petra Vance, didn't answer. Seraphina would learn weeks later that Damien had preemptively told their mutual social circle that she'd had some kind of breakdown and was behaving erratically. Her sister lived in another city and had 3 kids and a mortgage and no spare room and no extra capacity for crisis. The joint bank account was already frozen, the notification having arrived on her phone while she was still in the hearing room. The penthouse key in her clutch was, she discovered when she tried to think logically, already deactivated. Damien's security team was efficient. She had the clothes on her back, $63 in cash in the bottom of her bag, a lip gloss, her phone, and the earrings she was wearing, which were cubic zirconia, not real diamonds. Damien had swapped them at some point, and she'd never noticed. She walked because she didn't know what else to do. Blackthorn City. At 2 a.m. in November, rain was a specific kind of desolate. The financial district emptied out into long stone corridors of glass and concrete that reflected headlights in blurred orange streaks. She passed a closed dry cleaner, a bodega with the lights still on, a man sleeping under flattened cardboard in a doorway. She gave him the $63. He didn't wake up when she tucked it beside him. She felt the cold in her teeth now. Her dress had soaked through. The heels she was wearing were designed for marble floors, not wet sidewalks, and her right ankle had started to complain about the 3rd mile. She was thinking about nothing, which was the brain's way of thinking about everything without breaking apart, when she turned down a side street near the Harbor District and stopped. A black sedan was idling at the curb, not parked, idling. Engine running, exhaust rising in the cold air. The windows were tinted past the legal limit, the kind of tint that required paying a city official to ignore the citation. The body of the car was long and low, German-made, with small details. The custom grille, the reinforced side panels, that she wouldn't have been able to identify 6 months ago but could now, because living with a man like Damien Mercer meant learning to read the language of how powerful men moved through the world. This car belonged to someone very powerful. And it was idling here, on this empty street, at this hour. The rational thing was to turn around. Her ankle gave slightly when she shifted her weight, and the rain pushed harder. And the rational thing and the thing she actually did were not the same. She stood in the downpour staring at the car for a long moment. Then the rear door opened, not from someone inside reaching for a handle. It opened with the smooth, deliberate motion of someone who had been watching her and made a decision. The interior light was dim, and the rain on the window made it hard to see clearly, but she could see enough. A man, sitting very still, watching her with an expression she couldn't read from the street. She should have run. She was cold and her ankle hurt, and she had nowhere to run to, so instead she stepped close enough to see him clearly. He was older than she'd expected, somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40. Dark hair, no gray yet, cut close on the sides. A face that had been handsome before something had interrupted that process. A scar that ran from his left jaw to the corner of his mouth. Thin and silver pale, old enough that it had become part of his face rather than a disruption of it. His suit was black, his tie was black, and the watch on his wrist was silver and understated in the way that only truly expensive things are understated. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been searching for, not with hunger, with recognition. "Get in," he said. His voice was low and level, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it already occupied the full space of any room it entered. "I don't know you," Seraphina said. "I know." "Then why would I—" "Because you're standing in the rain at 2 a.m. with nowhere to go," he said. Not unkindly, just precisely. "And because I'm not going to hurt you. I've had 6 years to hurt you, and I never have." The sentence landed wrong. Too specific. Too weighted with something that was not a threat, but was not entirely comfort either. She heard a siren somewhere in the distance, felt the cold water running between her shoulder blades. Thought about Damien's face, the almost smile, the cufflinks, the 40-minute hair, and made the kind of decision that can't be made with the reasoning part of the brain. She got in the car. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. The interior was warm, leather and cedar, and something faintly metallic underneath that she couldn't identify. A man in the front passenger seat didn't turn around. The driver kept his eyes forward. The man beside her didn't move toward her, didn't speak immediately. He let the silence sit for a moment, which she interpreted as either respect or the confidence of someone who was never in a hurry. "Kyle Draven," he said finally. She knew the name. Everyone in Blackthorn City knew the name, in the way that everyone knew about fault lines running under cities, as something real and dangerous that you mostly tried not to think about. Kyle Draven was in import and export officially. Kyle Draven owned 3 casinos, 2 nightclubs, and a shipping company with contracts in 16 countries. Kyle Draven had been brought before a federal grand jury twice and had walked out both times, which meant either he was innocent or his lawyers were better than the law. The rumor, passed at the kinds of dinners Seraphina had spent 4 years attending, was that Kyle Draven had once made a problem disappear so completely that the problem's own family believed he'd moved abroad voluntarily. She'd never met him, had never been in the same room as him as far as she knew. "Seraphina Vale," she said. "I know who you are." He turned to look out the rain-streaked window as the car began to move. "I've known who you are for a long time." "That should terrify me." "It should," he agreed. "Does it?" She thought about it honestly. The honest answer was that she was too exhausted and too cold to feel terror properly, that her emotional capacity had maxed out somewhere around the moment Damien's attorney had slid that manila folder across the table, and that what she mostly felt right now was a flat, strange calm that she suspected was the beginning of shock. "Not right now," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't a smile, not quite. A fractional easing of the jaw, a small adjustment around the eyes. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. "I don't have anywhere to go." He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd already understood. "There's a hotel, the Caldwell on 5th. I have a standing arrangement, Sus. The staff will put you in a suite, no questions, no credit card required. You can stay as long as you need." "Why?" It wasn't a question. It was the word stripped of its interrogative pretension, laid flat, waiting for him to explain himself. He was quiet for a long moment. The car rolled through wet streets, past streetlights blurred by rain on glass, past the dark fronts of closed restaurants and parking structures. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you just need somewhere dry." She stared at him. He was looking forward again, at the back of the driver's seat, with the stillness of a man accustomed to sitting with uncomfortable silence and outlasting it. Against every instinct she'd developed in 4 years of living with a man who withheld explanations to retain power, she recognized something different in Kyle Draven's silence. He wasn't withholding to control her. He was withholding because the explanation was long and the night was short, and he understood, somehow, that she couldn't absorb it yet. She said nothing else until the car stopped in front of the Caldwell. The hotel's awning attendant came out immediately with an umbrella. The front desk manager, a man in his 50s who carried himself with the quiet efficiency of someone well compensated for discretion, met her in the lobby with a key card and no questions, and a gentle mention that there was a bathrobe and dry clothing in the suite's wardrobe, various sizes. Please let them know if nothing fit. She was almost to the elevator when she turned around. Kyle Draven was still standing just inside the lobby entrance. He hadn't followed her. He was watching her go, hands in his pockets, completely still. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He looked at her across 20 feet of marble lobby floor. "Because you're owed a debt," he said. She didn't know what that meant. She went upstairs, ran a bath hot enough to pink her skin, and sat in it until the water went cold. Then she got out, wrapped herself in the bathrobe, and sat on the edge of the king-size bed in a hotel suite that was larger than the apartment Damien was having her evicted from, and she let herself cry for exactly 8 minutes. She timed it. Then she stopped, because she was 31 years old, and she had signed a document that should not have existed, and someone had just dismantled her life using her own name, and she could either mourn that or she could think her way through it. She thought for 3 hours. By the time gray November dawn came through the curtains, she had a working theory. Every charge against her would be traceable to documents she hadn't signed, accounts she hadn't opened, and wire transfers with timestamps that would conflict with her physical location if anyone bothered to look. The problem was that no one was going to bother to look unless someone made them. She needed evidence. She needed someone Damien couldn't reach. She needed time. She had none of those things. Her phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. A news alert. She opened it without thinking. The headline read, "Mercer reveals year-long relationship with socialite Celeste Arden, says failed marriage forced him to seek comfort elsewhere." Below the headline was a photograph taken outside the courthouse last night. Damien and Celeste Arden, tall, honey blonde, dressed in an ivory coat that Seraphina had once complimented in a magazine and then forgotten, standing together in the rain, his arm around her shoulders. Celeste wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at Damien with an expression of practiced vulnerability. The photograph was perfectly lit. Someone had called the photographer. Seraphina set the phone face down on the nightstand, stared at the ceiling, felt something happen in her chest that was not heartbreak. She'd processed that somewhere around month 8 of the marriage when she'd stopped expecting him to come home for dinner without a reason, but was something older and colder and more structural, like a building shifting on its foundation, like the moment before ice gives. She had loved Damien Mercer. She had. She'd loved the version of him that existed in the first year, the version that had seemed interested in her mind and her laugh and her opinions about things, the version that asked about her piano playing and listened to her talk about contract law and said she was the most interesting person in every room they shared. That version had been a project. She understood that fully now, at 6:47 in the morning, in a hotel suite paid for by the city's most dangerous man, reading a headline that told her the affair had started before their second anniversary. The whole thing had been a project. She'd been selected, groomed, installed, used, and then carefully discarded in a way designed to destroy her credibility before she could use what she knew against him. The question was, what did she know? More than he thought. That was the one thing she was certain of. She got up, put on the kettle, and began to compose a mental inventory of every document she'd photographed on her phone during the last 8 months of their marriage, Not because she'd known what she was doing exactly, but because something had been wrong for a long time, and she'd developed the habit of paying close attention and keeping records without fully admitting to herself why. That phone. She needed that phone to be secure. She was running through her options when someone knocked at the door. Not the light tap of housekeeping, a specific knock. 3, pause, 2, that felt like code. She crossed the room and looked through the peephole. A woman stood in the corridor. Late 20s, compact build, wearing dark slacks and a gray turtleneck, her hair pulled back. She was carrying a small leather case and looking at the door with the patient expression of someone who expected to be let in. Seraphina opened the door. "My name is Dara," the woman said. Her accent was flat, neutral, untraceable. "Mr. Draven sent me. I'm going to help you secure your device and make copies of anything on it that you might need later." She paused. "He thought you'd have information worth protecting." Seraphina looked at her for a long moment. "He knows I have records," Seraphina said. "He suspected," Dara said. "He says you're smart enough to have been paying attention." Something compressed in Seraphina's throat. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more complicated. The feeling of being seen by someone when you've spent years being looked through. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. She didn't know, as Dara set up the equipment on the writing desk and began a clinical, efficient process of encrypting and backing up everything on Seraphina's phone, that this morning was the last morning of one version of her life. She didn't know that the inventory she'd been quietly building for 8 months, the account numbers, the contract anomalies, the photographs of documents left on desks at the wrong time, would eventually become the architecture of a case that brought down one of Blackthorn City's oldest financial empires. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was that rain was still hitting the window, and the kettle had boiled, and the woman named Dara worked in silence with the concentrated efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again, and that somewhere in this city, Kyle Draven had sent help before she'd asked for it. And she didn't know yet whether that was a gift or a transaction. She suspected it was both. Dara finished her work 2 hours later, handed Seraphina an encrypted drive the size of a thumb, and said, "He'd like to meet with you tonight, if you're willing." Seraphina turned the drive over in her fingers. "Tell him I'm willing," she said, "but I'm not grateful yet. I need to understand what he wants." Dara looked at her without expression. Then something shifted briefly. Not quite a smile, but its shadow. "He said you'd say something like that," she said. Then she picked up her case, nodded once, and left. Seraphina stood in this quiet hotel suite, drive in hand, yesterday's devastation sitting in her chest like cold gravel, and thought about the photograph of Damien and Celeste in the rain, and the almost smile at the corner of his mouth as she signed, and the account numbers she'd photographed, and the specific, deliberate way Kyle Draven had said, "You're owed a debt." She didn't know what currency that debt was in, but she was going to find out. That night, when the second knock came, 3, pause, 2, she was dressed, steady, and ready. Kyle Draven was waiting in a private room on the hotel's top floor with a glass of water and no small talk. And what he told her in the next hour would shatter every assumption she had left about why she was still alive, and what he had been willing to do to keep her that way. The private room on the 14th floor had no name on the door and no number on the wall beside it. Just a stretch of blank corridor and a keypad that Dara entered without hesitation, pressing a sequence Seraphina didn't try to memorize. The lock disengaged with a sound like a held breath releasing. Inside, the room was not what she'd expected. No bodyguards stationed at the walls, no display of weaponry or wealth, just a long rectangular space with low lighting, a table of dark wood, 2 chairs, a bottle of still water and 2 glasses, and Kyle Draven standing at the floor-to-ceiling window with his back to her, looking out at a city that was still raining. Dara entered, set her leather case on a small side table near the door, and left without a word. The door closed behind her. Seraphina stood just inside the room and let the silence exist for a moment before she decided to stop waiting for him to set the terms. "You said I'm owed a debt," she said. He turned from the window. He'd changed his shirt since the car, still dark, still pressed, and the overhead light caught the scar on his jaw at a sharper angle than before. He gestured toward one of the chairs. She sat. Not because he gestured, but because her ankle still ached and she wanted the structural advantage of being settled before this conversation began. He sat across from her, poured water into both glasses without asking, pushed one toward her. 3 years ago, he said, you were at Blackthorn Central Station. Late October. There was a fire in the southbound tunnel, an electrical fault in one of the older carriages. She remembered it, fragments of it. She'd been on her way back from a client meeting she still had back when she was 2 years out of law school and briefly employed before Damien suggested she spend her time more productively supporting his career. The smoke had come fast and low, and people had panicked the way crowds do when enclosed space and fear combine, surging in the wrong directions, compressing against locked emergency exits. There was a girl, she said slowly, 17 years old. Her name is Mira. Seraphina felt something shift in her sternum. She had a precise physical memory of pulling a girl by the wrist through a service corridor she'd found by accident, or not by accident, because she'd grown up near that station and had once spent an afternoon as a child mapping its maintenance routes with a flashlight. The girl had been coughing so hard she'd folded in half. Seraphina had braced her arm around the girl's back and moved them both through the smoke and out through a maintenance exit onto the wet platform surface of a disused line. When they'd come out, she'd been swarmed by emergency personnel who directed her toward a triage area. She'd looked back once, and the girl was already being pulled toward a paramedic. Seraphina had given a statement to the transit authority investigator, declined medical attention, and taken a cab home. She hadn't thought much about it after. She'd been mildly heroic by accident, the way people sometimes are, and then life had continued. Mira is my sister, Kyle said. Seraphina looked at him. The shape of the sentence was simple. The weight behind it was not. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. Not soft, never soft, but carrying something careful. He'd been holding this particular piece of information for a long time, waiting for the correct moment, and even now that he'd said it, he watched her with the measured attention of someone who needed to see exactly how she received it. She could have died in that tunnel, he said. She should have, statistically. The carriage she was in collapsed 11 minutes after you got her out. Seraphina's hands were in her lap. She looked at the water glass. I didn't know her name. No, you just pulled her out and disappeared. I didn't disappear. I gave a statement and went home. I know. I read the statement. He paused. I've read most things that have your name on them. The sentence landed with deliberate weight. She let it sit. For how long, she said. Since the station. 3 years of her life passed through her mind in a rapid, unpleasant inventory. The engagement party, the wedding, the incremental disappearance of her professional ambitions, the locked office in the penthouse that Damien said was for tax documents, the dinners she'd attended where she'd smiled at the right times and excused herself to the restroom when the conversation turned to things she wasn't supposed to hear. That's a long time to watch someone without introducing yourself, she said. You'd found someone. You were happy. He looked at the window briefly. Or I thought you were. When did you stop thinking that? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. He was the least evasive person she'd been in a room with in years, which was its own unsettling quality, like a room with no furniture to hide behind. 14 months ago, he said. There was a dinner at the Mercer Foundation benefit. You left early. Damien told the table you weren't feeling well. I was 3 tables over. She remembered the dinner. She remembered Damien's hand tight around her upper arm in the elevator lobby, and his voice low and clipped, telling her she'd embarrassed him by asking a question about the foundation's overseas accounts in front of a board member. She remembered the elevator ride up to the coat check in silence, and then the cab home alone while he went back inside, and she sat in the dark apartment telling herself it was a bad night and not a pattern. You saw that, she said flatly. I saw you leave. And I saw his face when you did. He looked at her directly. I knew what his face meant. She picked up the water glass and took a slow drink because her mouth had gone dry, and she needed a second to rebuild her composure around what he'd just said. He'd been in that room. He'd watched that particular small brutality unfold, and he'd understood it, and he'd sat at his table 3 rows back and, You did nothing, she said. You had a husband and a life, and I had no claim on either of them. His voice didn't change. There's no version of me arriving at your side at a charity benefit that ends well for you. She thought about that. He was right, which irritated her. "So you waited," she said. "I prepared." "For what, specifically?" "For Damien to make a mistake bad enough that I could move on it without collateral damage to you." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, and she noticed for the first time that his hands were not soft. The knuckles were thick. There were small scars across the back of his right hand that looked old and deliberate. What happened last night was not his first mistake. It was his first public one. He's been building the case against you for 18 months while simultaneously hollowing out the company using your identity as a shield. "I know," she said. Something flickered across his face. "You know how much?" "I know about the secondary accounts routed through an LLC registered in the Cayman Islands that I've never heard of, whose formation documents have my forged signature. I know about the 3 contracts with Verano Shipping that were signed under emergency authorization while I was in the hospital for 4 days in July with appendicitis, and therefore physically impossible for me to have reviewed. I know that the company's CFO, a man named Torrance Hale, has been terrified of me for 6 months for reasons I couldn't explain until tonight." She stopped, took another drink of water. "I know because I photographed everything I thought was wrong," she said. "I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I needed to." Kale was looking at her with that expression again. Recognition. Like she kept confirming something he'd already calculated. "Torrance Hale came to me 4 months ago," he said. The water glass stopped halfway to the table. "He was looking for insurance," Kale continued. "Someone outside Damien's reach who could verify his cooperation if the company went under. He brought documents." He reached into the interior of his jacket and placed a folded envelope on the table between them. "Including the original formation documents for the Cayman LLC, with the signature comparison that demonstrates the forgery." Seraphina stared at the envelope. "You've had this for 4 months," she said. "Yes." "And you didn't—" She stopped, rearranged the sentence. "You let him build that case against me for 4 more months with this in your possession. Moving too early would have collapsed the evidentiary chain. Damien needed to commit fully. If I'd surfaced this 4 months ago, his lawyers would have had time to—" "I understand the legal reasoning," she said quietly. "I'm asking about the other part." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This one had weight and friction. "You're asking if I let you walk into that courtroom knowing what was going to happen," he said. "Yes." He was still. "Yes," he said. "I did." She had expected the answer. The honesty of it still landed like something solid hitting her in the chest. "That's a very cold thing to do," she said. "It is." "You could have warned me." "I could have. But a warned Seraphina Vale doesn't sign those divorce papers. An unwarned Seraphina Vale signs them in front of every camera in Blackthorn City and gives the evidence she didn't know she was giving. That Damien forced a fully unjust settlement under duress on national television, which becomes relevant when we dismantle him in court." He paused. "I needed the public record, and I needed you to sign without knowing it was going to be used." She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to be very angry about this," she said. "You should be. But you're also the only person in this city who currently has the documentation to keep me out of federal prison." "Yes." So, he said, and waited. She exhaled slowly through her nose and looked at the envelope on the table, the water glass, the window behind him, and the rain beyond it. She thought about Damien's almost smile and Celeste Arden's practiced vulnerability, and the 43 minutes she'd spent in a bathtub trying to feel temperature again, and the 8 minutes of crying she'd rationed for herself like a resource in short supply. "What do you want?" she said. "Specifically, in return." "Nothing." "That's not an answer. It's the true one." He met her eyes. "You pulled Mira out of a burning train. She is the one person in my life I would burn everything else to protect. You saved her and disappeared without asking what she was worth to me. I've spent 3 years trying to work out how to clear a debt like that." He looked at the envelope. "This is the closest I can get." "That's not nothing," Seraphina said. "That's guilt with a very long fuse." Something moved briefly in his expression, not offense. something she'd have called dark amusement on a man with a less complicated face. "It might be," he said. "Does that change whether you want the evidence?" It didn't, and they both knew it didn't. She reached across the table and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it that night. There was a time for that, and it wasn't at 2 in the morning across a table from a man she'd known for 9 hours, and was not sure she should trust, but was already trusting in ways she couldn't entirely account for. She held the envelope and thought about the next move. "Damien's attorney will file the federal referral by end of business tomorrow," she said. "She won't," Kyle said. "Harriet Solis has her own complications, as a conflict of interest related to a personal investment she made using information from Mercer Industries' confidential contracts. She can't file that referral without opening a conversation she doesn't want to have." He paused. "She knows I know. We've reached an understanding." Seraphina absorbed this. How many people do you have in his orbit? Enough. Torrance Hale, Harriet Solis, who else? He looked at her calmly. "That's not information you need tonight." She filed that away. It wasn't evasion. It was the reasonable position of someone who had been operating a network carefully for years and was not going to expose all of it in the first conversation. She could respect the reasoning while resenting the limitation. "I need a lawyer," she said. "Not Pell. Someone who answers to me. There's a woman named Cleo Marsh, civil and criminal practice, former federal prosecutor, does not currently take cases from Mercer Industries or their adjacent firms because she spent 12 years trying to build a case against Damien in her private capacity following her sister's wrongful termination from the company in 2019. He said it the way you read a prepared document, smooth and thorough. She will take your case. I had Dara reach out this morning." Seraphina stared at him. "This morning," she said, "before 7 a.m. I hadn't agreed to anything by 7 a.m. "No," he said, "but I had." She should have pushed back on that. The presumption of it was significant, the unilateral decision-making, the assumption that she would arrive at the agreement he'd already prepared for. It was the kind of thing that, in a different man, in a different context, would have sent her walking toward the door. What stopped her was that he was right. And he'd done it before she asked, which meant he'd been paying enough attention to know what she needed before she'd articulated it, which was not something she'd experienced from the direction of someone trying to help her in a very long time. She was not going to tell him that. Not tonight. "I want to meet Cleo Marsh before I agree to work with her," she said. "She'll be here at 9 a.m. The next weeks were the strangest of her life, which was saying something given the competition. The Caldwell became her temporary base of operations, a suite paid for by a mechanism she didn't ask about, and Kyle didn't explain, with the security details she was eventually told was present, though she never saw them directly. Dara became a fixture, arriving each morning with a laptop, encrypted communications, and the flat competence of someone who treated crisis management as routine maintenance. Cleo Marsh arrived at 9 that first morning and turned out to be a 44-year-old woman with close-cropped silver-streaked hair and reading glasses she kept removing and tapping against her palm when she was thinking. She reviewed everything on Seraphina's phone and the documents from Kyle's envelope in 3 hours, and her first sentence after setting the last page down was, "We can bury him." Her second sentence was, "But it's going to take time, and it's going to be ugly, and you're going to have to be willing to be in the room for all of it." "I'm willing," Seraphina said. Cleo looked at her over the reading glasses. "You understand what being in Draven's orbit does to your public perception." "My public perception is already the floor," Seraphina said. "There's nowhere to go but up." Cleo made a sound that might have been a laugh and put the glasses back on. What followed was a methodical grinding process. Document analysis, forensic accounting, sourcing testimony from Mercer Industries' former employees who had their own grievances. Cleo worked 18-hour days with a focused ferocity that Seraphina recognized as personal. For Cleo, this was not just a case. It was a decade of accumulated anger given legal form. Seraphina threw herself into it with the same energy, but the work also gave her proximity to the organization it was built around. She couldn't spend 12 hours a day working with Dara and meeting periodically with Kyle's people without beginning to understand what that organization was and how it functioned. It was not what she'd assumed. She'd grown up with a social class's vague understanding of organized crime as brutality in expensive clothing, dangerous, crude underneath the surface, driven by greed and held together by fear. What she found instead was something more complex and less comforting, a structure with its own internal logic, its own ethics even, that operated at the intersection of legitimate business and things that fell well outside legal definition, and that had lasted as long as it had not, because it was purely violent, but because Kyle Draven had understood early that the most durable kind of power wasn't the kind that crushed opposition, but the kind that made opposition inconvenient. She didn't romanticize it. She'd grown up adjacent to enough institutional power to understand that all large organizations had blood somewhere in their foundations, if you look carefully enough. She just looked carefully. Kyle himself she saw 3 or 4 times a week, usually in the evenings, usually briefly, in arrangements that always felt deliberately structured to give her maximum information and minimum pressure. He never asked her how she was feeling. He asked her what she needed and what she'd learned and what she thought about specific situations, and he listened to her answers with genuine attention. She found that she talked more in those conversations than she had in most of the preceding 4 years. 6 weeks in, she was reviewing a set of financial documents in the hotel suite at 11 at night when Dara appeared in the doorway, which meant something had changed because Dara didn't appear unannounced. "There's a situation," Dara said. "What kind?" "The legal kind, but it's moving fast." She held out her phone. On the screen was a news alert. The headline read, "Mercer Industries CEO launches counter-investigation. Federal sources say criminal referral pending against former wife." Seraphina read the article in 40 seconds. The Harriet Solis situation had been more complicated than Kyle had indicated, or had become more complicated. The federal referral had been filed after all, not by Solis, but by a second attorney Damien had quietly retained, and it had been filed with a specific federal prosecutor who had, according to the article's sourcing, a long-standing professional relationship with the Mercer family. She set the phone on the table. "Where's Kyle?" she said. "He knows. He's asking if you want to meet tonight." "Yes." She was already standing. Now. The meeting this time was not in the hotel. Dara drove her to a building in the warehouse district that had, on the outside, the appearance of a disused light manufacturing space and had, on the inside, a completely different architecture. Converted floors, climate-controlled rooms, the low hum of server banks somewhere below them. Not a residence, an operational space. Kale was at a large table with 3 people she hadn't met before, 2 men and a woman, all of them in the kind of focus that meant something was actively happening and not in a good direction. He looked up when she came in. "Sit down," he said. "You need to hear this." She sat. The woman at the table, compact, dark-haired, who she'd later learn was named Reyes, pulled up a document on the laptop in front of her. The referral went to a prosecutor named Calvin Pruitt. Pruitt handled the Mercer Foundation audit in 2018 and found nothing, which is interesting because our own review of that audit period suggests there was something to find. He's been managing the relationship with the Mercer legal team through a former colleague who now works in their general counsel's office. "He's bought," Seraphina said. "Almost certainly," Reyes said without inflection. "The referral has been fast-tracked in a way that normal federal procedure doesn't usually accommodate. Arraignment on fraud charges in approximately 10 to 14 days if they get the grand jury seated." 10 days. Seraphina looked at the table surface for a moment, counting backward through the timeline of what Cleo Marsh had assembled. It was comprehensive. It was not finished. "Can we accelerate?" she asked. "On some of it," Reyes said. "But the strongest evidence, the LLC formation documents, the Cayman routing, the forged signatures, those need an independent forensic analysis to hold up in court. That takes time we may not have." "How much time do you need?" Seraphina said. 3 weeks minimum." "I have 10 days. Kael spoke. "There's a second option." She looked at him. His face was careful, not apologetic. She didn't think apologetic was a mode he used often, but carrying something that looked like the effort of presenting information he knew would be received badly. "We move you," he said, "outside Blackthorn. Somewhere Pruitt's jurisdiction doesn't reach while Cleo continues building the case. When it's ready, you come back." The room was quiet. Seraphina looked at Cale Draven across the table. This man who had spent 3 years watching a debt accumulate and had spent the last 6 weeks dismantling her previous life and reassembling it on a different foundation. And she understood that he was offering her safety in the way he understood safety: removal, control of the perimeter, management of the threat. "No," she said. A slight tension moved through the room, not from Kyle, from the two men she didn't know, which told her they weren't accustomed to that word being said to him in this space. "Seraphina," he began. "I'm not leaving Blackthorn," she said. Her voice was level. "I'm not going to sit in a safe house somewhere while Damian Mercer tells the entire city I fled federal charges. That becomes its own narrative. I don't get to come back from that narrative, even if we win the legal case." She looked at Reyes. "What happens if we go public with the forensic analysis we have now? Incomplete, but enough to establish the forgery question in the press?" Reyes glanced at Kyle, a micro-movement, instinctive. Seraphina saw it and filed it. "It accelerates the narrative war," Reyes said carefully. "Could work in your favor. Creates public doubt before the arraignment. Could also spook Damian's people into destroying evidence we haven't copied yet." "What evidence hasn't been copied?" "A beat. There's a secondary server at Mercer Industries headquarters. Encrypted, isolated. We believe it contains the original wire transfer authorizations. The ones where Damian's direct fingerprints are on the transactions he blamed on you. It's not been accessed yet because physical access requires proximity, and the building's security was upgraded 3 weeks ago." She heard the shape of what wasn't being said. "Someone needs to go into the building," she said. Another micro-glance toward Kyle from Reyes. "Not you," Kale said firmly. "That's not— I have a legitimate reason to be in that building," Seraphina said. "I was the co-owner of record until 72 hours ago. My access credentials may still work during the transition grace period before the legal transfer completes. Standard corporate protocol gives former officers 30 days to retrieve personal property." The silence in the room changed quality again. "That's a narrow legal window that Damian will be watching for exactly this reason," Kyle said. "Yes," she agreed. "So it has to be done before he thinks to close it." She watched him work through the calculation behind his eyes. The risk variables, the alternatives, the probability of outcome in each direction. It was visible in small ways, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his right hand moved once on the table surface before going still. "I need a day to prepare the approach," he said finally. "We have 10 days total," she said. "Use one." He looked at her for a long moment, not the way Damian had looked at her, through her, past her, at the version of her he'd constructed for his own purposes. Cale Draven looked at her the way you look at a person you're genuinely uncertain about, in the way that means they keep surprising you. "All right," he said quietly. She nodded and looked back at Reyes. "Walk me through the building's current security layout." She did not sleep that night. By 4 in the morning, she was still at the table in the warehouse space while the other people moved in and out around her, reviewing floor plans, security guard rotation schedules, the access protocol for the executive server room on the 31st floor. Dara had materialized at some point with coffee and said nothing, which was one of the things Seraphina had come to appreciate most about Dara, who seemed to understand intuitively that some people needed silence more than comfort. Around 5 a.m., Kyle came back into the room. He'd been gone for 2 hours. He sat across from her, looked at the documents spread across the table, and said, "I need to tell you something about the building." His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the managerial register he used when running a room. She looked up. "Damian added a new security contract 6 weeks ago," Kyle said. "The company that holds the contract, I didn't know until an hour ago who the client behind it was." "Who?" "Victor Lazar." The name landed without resonance because she didn't know it yet, and he could see that in her face. "He runs the Lazar Syndicate," Kyle said. "Eastern European operation, moved into Blackthorn 3 years ago. We have a—" He paused, choosing the word with precision. "Complicated history. If Lazar's people are controlling security in that building, it changes the risk calculation significantly." "Why would Damian hire Lazar's security firm?" Kyle looked at the table for a moment. "Because someone introduced them. And the only reason someone would introduce a desperate man with a collapsing empire to Victor Lazar is because Lazar wants something that man has. He looked up, which means Damien has already made a deal, and the deal almost certainly involves me. The room felt very still. He's selling you out, she said, to Lazar, in exchange for protection from the federal investigation, resources to disappear, and possibly, Kyle said, with a careful flatness that she was learning to recognize as the register he used when the information was genuinely dangerous. Information about my operation's internal structure, Kyle said. Routes, safe houses, supply chains, the kind of information that only exists in one place. He stopped. Seraphina watched his face go through something she hadn't seen on it before. Not fear. Something older and more specific than fear. The expression of a man who has just understood that someone inside his walls has been talking. You have a leak, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the documents on the table, at the floor plans spread between them, at the security rotation schedule with Lazar's company logo now visible in the corner of the contract header that Reyes had pulled up on the laptop screen. He looked at all of it the way you look at a room you've lived in for years after discovering one of the walls is hollow. Yes, he said. It appears I do. The warehouse space felt different after that sentence. The low hum of the server banks continued unchanged. Dara was at the far end of the room with her back to them, and she hadn't moved. The two men Seraphina didn't know had left an hour ago. Reyes was still at her laptop, but her hands had gone still on the keyboard. Seraphina looked at Kyle Draven, at the scar along his jaw, at the silver watch, at the thick knuckles resting on the table surface, and felt the precise texture of the situation they were both now sitting inside. How many people knew about the warehouse address, she said. 12. How many knew about the server on the 31st floor? A pause. 7. Does Reyes know both? Reyes turned from the laptop. Her face was without expression, but she turned at the sound of her name and met Seraphina's eyes with the steadiness of someone who had been waiting for this question and had already decided how she would answer it. Yes, Reyes said. I know both. The room absorbed this. Kael's hand on the table was very still. Reyes, he said. His voice had changed register again. Not the operational tone, not the quiet private one, something below both. Flat and cold and very deliberate the way a blade is flat and cold before it moves. I haven't spoken to Lazar, Reyes said. I want to say that first. Then say the rest of it, Kael said. She closed the laptop. The soft click of it was very loud in the silence. She turned her chair to face him fully and put her hands flat on the table in front of her, palms down, in a gesture that was either surrender or the prelude to an argument she intended to win. I spoke to Torrance Hale 6 weeks ago, she said, before he came to you. He contacted me first because he needed to verify that the information he had would be received by someone with enough reach to actually use it. I told him to go to you directly. I didn't pass his information to Lazar. I didn't pass anything to Lazar. But, Kael said, a long breath from Reyes. My brother has been in a Lazar facility for 4 months. He runs product for them in the Port District. He got caught skimming, and they're holding him as a lesson. She looked at the table surface for a moment, then back up. 3 weeks ago, someone from Lazar's operation contacted me. They said my brother comes home if I provide location confirmation on 2 of our safe houses. Just confirmation of addresses they claimed they already had. Did you? The word sat in the air like a stone above water. No, she said. But I didn't tell you about the contact. And I spent 3 weeks trying to find a way to get Marcus out without using what they wanted, which means for 3 weeks I was a liability in this room, and you didn't know it. She looked at Kael directly. That's the full accounting. I'm giving it to you now because if we're going into that building with the situation the way it is, you need to know who's clean and who isn't. Seraphina watched Kael process this. It was not a fast process. He sat with it. With the specific shape of Reyes's compromise, with the 3 weeks of withheld information, with the brother in a Lazar facility that was both the leverage point and the explanatory frame, and his face didn't change in any way a casual observer would notice. But Seraphina had spent enough time watching him across tables to see the micro-adjustments, the small tightening at the corner of his mouth, the single slow blink that was not tiredness. He was deciding what Reyes was worth. "Where's Marcus now?" he said. "Same facility, Port District, South Warehouse Cluster. Alive. As of 2 days ago." Kale looked at Dara. Something passed between them without language, a long-standing communicative shorthand that Seraphina had noticed before and still didn't fully understand. Dara nodded once, the barest movement, and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to make a call," Kyle said to Reyes. "By tomorrow morning, your brother will be somewhere other than that facility. You will then owe me a significant debt which you will repay by being completely available and completely transparent for the duration of what comes next." He paused. "If that arrangement is acceptable." Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression. Not relief, exactly. The emotion that exists on the other side of relief. After you've been carrying something so long, your body has forgotten how to stand up straight without it. "Yes," she said. "It's acceptable." Kyle looked back at Seraphina. "We need to move on the building tomorrow, not in 3 days. Tomorrow, before Lazar's people have time to harden the security further now that the contact has been surfaced." "I'll be ready," she said. She almost was. The preparation took 18 hours and felt like 6 days compressed into a single continuous moment of controlled urgency. Cleo Marsh was brought in at 7 that morning and spent 3 hours establishing the legal framework for Seraphina's right to access company premises under the former officer clause. A genuine legal argument, carefully documented, that would hold up to initial scrutiny even if it wouldn't survive a prolonged challenge. The point was not to survive a prolonged challenge. The point was to get through the front door of Mercer Industries headquarters on the 46th floor of Mercer Tower before anyone thought to explicitly revoke the credential. The building's access system hadn't been updated yet. Her old keycard still registered in the system as active. This was confirmed by a quiet inquiry from someone in Kyle's network who had access to the building management software, and it created a window that was both an opportunity and a trap. The most obvious thing in the world to a security team that was actively looking for it. The solution Reyes designed was to give them something else to look at. At 11:45 a.m., on a Thursday in December, Seraphina Vale walked through the lobby of Mercer Tower wearing a dark coat and her own face, carrying a leather tote, with Dara 12 feet behind her pretending to be on a phone call. The lobby security desk was staffed by 2 people, one of whom she recognized from her years as a regular presence in this building, and one she didn't know. And the one she didn't know had the specific quality of watchfulness that distinguished Lazar's personnel from a standard corporate security hire. She walked directly to the desk. "Seraphina Vale," she said, "former executive officer, personal property retrieval under Section 31 of the Interim Transfer Agreement. My attorney filed the formal notice this morning." She set a document on the counter. Genuine, prepared by Cleo, and containing enough legal language that the security officer would need at least 90 seconds to begin assessing it. The guard she recognized, his name was Phillips, she'd brought him coffee twice during late nights at the office 4 years ago, glanced at the document and then at her face with the visible discomfort of a man caught between a protocol he understood and an authority structure he couldn't read. The Lazar guard was already reaching for his phone. Seraphina kept her eyes on Phillips. "I'll need access to the 31st floor executive administrative suite. There are personal documents and some family photographs that weren't included in the property inventory." She paused. "I trust that's not going to be a problem, given the legal notice." "Ms. Vale." Phillips kept his voice neutral. "I'll need to confirm with—" "You can confirm with anyone you'd like," she said pleasantly. "I'll wait right here while you do." She was not going to wait right there. She was going to stand exactly where she was standing for 45 seconds, which was long enough for the secondary element of Reyes's plan to operate. Somewhere in the building's administrative network, a maintenance request had been triggered by a remote access point, a routine-looking system notification that would route both security guards' confirmation calls through a switchboard number that would be answered, briefly, by someone whose voice matched the building's head of facilities management closely enough to pass a non-suspicious listener. The Lazar guard made his call, listened, looked at the document again, looked at her, said, "Stand by," with the flatness of someone who was not fully convinced, but had been told to allow the process to proceed. She took the elevator to the 31st floor. Dara did not follow her into the elevator. That had been the plan. Single point of access, clean entry, the kind of presence that doesn't accumulate footprint. Seraphina rode up alone, watching the floor numbers change, breathing slowly through her nose. The executive administrative suite on 31 was empty at midday. Most of Mercer Industries' staff had been sent home during the ongoing legal and financial crisis, and the skeleton crew that remained was concentrated on upper floors. She moved through the open-plan space with the knowledge of someone who had spent time here, past the row of assistant workstations and the glass-walled conference room, toward the back corridor that led to the server room. The server room door required a separate credential, a PIN she no longer had or shouldn't have. Except that 6 months ago, during one of the late nights she'd spent in this building when Damien was traveling, she'd been locking up the executive floor, and the IT manager, a nervous young man named Felix, who was scared of everyone above a certain pay grade, had asked her to hold the server room door for him because his hands were full. She'd stood with her hand on the door panel and watched him punch in the pin without thinking, and she'd remembered it the way she remembered most things, automatically, because her memory was precise and she hadn't learned yet to turn that faculty off even when the information seemed useless. She punched in the pin. The door opened. The server room was cold and loud with the white noise of cooling systems. She found the isolated server in the secondary rack where the floor plan said it would be. A standalone unit, physically air-gapped from the main network, with a USB port and a data transfer capability that required the physical drive Reyes had prepared and placed in the inner pocket of her coat 3 hours earlier. She plugged it in. The transfer was supposed to take 4 minutes. She was at 2 minutes and 30 seconds when her phone buzzed twice in her pocket. The signal that meant abort, which meant something had changed in the lobby. She did not abort. She stood in the cold server room with the transfer running and her phone buzzing and her heart doing something loud and structural in her chest, and she counted seconds, and at 3 minutes 58 seconds, the drive light went solid, and she pulled it and put it in her inner pocket and walked back out into the corridor. The man standing at the end of the corridor was not Phillips. He was tall, light-haired, with the kind of physical stillness that doesn't come from training so much as from genuine indifference to whether the person across from him is frightened. He was wearing a dark suit that fit well enough to be expensive, and he was looking at her with an expression of mild interest, the way you look at something unexpected that you're already deciding what to do with. She had never met Victor Lazar. She knew, looking at him, that this was Victor Lazar. "Ms. Vale," he said. His accent was faint, Eastern European, smoothed by years of deliberate effort. "You're either very brave or very foolish. I'm curious which." She kept walking toward him, not because she had a plan for getting past him, because stopping was worse. "I'm retrieving personal property," she said. "No," he said. "You're not." He tilted his head slightly. "You're retrieving data from an isolated server that belongs to a man who is currently a business associate of mine. That's a different thing entirely." He paused. "I'd like the drive." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Ms. Vale?" His tone was patient and absolutely without warmth. "I've been in this building for 2 hours. I was here when your attorney filed the notice this morning, which was, I'll give you credit, a competent piece of misdirection. But I've had people watching that server room for 10 days. I knew someone was coming for it. I simply wasn't certain it would be you personally." Something moved in his expression. Appreciation, she thought, which was the most unsettling version of the emotion. "Draven sent you in yourself. That's interesting." "Draven didn't send me," she said. "I made this call." Lazar studied her for a moment. "Even more interesting." He extended his hand, palm up, waiting. She stood in the fluorescent light of the 31st floor corridor with the server drive in her inner pocket and Victor Lazar between her and the elevator, and 2 minutes of data on a physical device that could end Damien Mercer and potentially crack the arrangement between these two men wide open, and she did the calculation she had available to her. She gave him the drive. She held his gaze while she did it, reached into her coat, retrieved the drive, placed it in his outstretched palm without breaking eye contact. His fingers closed around it with the efficiency of someone completing a transaction. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," she said. He almost smiled. "You can go. The lobby has been notified that your visit is concluded." She walked to the elevator. Her back was to him for the entire length of the corridor, and she felt every inch of it. The particular vulnerability of moving away from something dangerous. The discipline required not to speed up, not to show that discipline. She pressed the call button. The elevator arrived in 12 seconds. She stepped in. The doors closed. She stood in the elevator box as it descended and felt the shape of what had just happened assembling itself into a clear and devastating structure. Lazar had been there before her, had let the plan run, had let Reyes design it, had let Seraphina walk through the lobby, had let her reach the server room and complete the transfer. Because the point was never the drive. The point was to see how far she would go and who she was going there for. He'd had 10 days of advanced knowledge and he'd spent them watching, which meant the leak wasn't Reyes. She walked through the lobby at a pace that was not running. Phillips watched her go. The Lazar guard did not move. She pushed through the revolving door into the cold midday street, turned right, walked 40 feet, turned into the narrow service alley they designated as the secondary exit point, and stood with her back against the brick wall and breathed. Dara appeared at the alley entrance in 90 seconds. One look at Seraphina's face and she said, "What happened?" Lazar was there. Seraphina's voice was completely steady, which she found faintly alarming. "He took the drive." Dara went very still. "He let me complete the transfer, and then he took the drive." Seraphina looked at the alley wall across from her. Brick, old, darkened by years of city weather. "He's known about the plan for 10 days. Reyes isn't the leak. The leak is older than Reyes' situation." Dara said nothing. She was on her phone already, moving her thumb across the screen with the rapid, precise efficiency of someone running a damage control protocol. "Where is Kael?" Seraphina said. "He's been trying to reach you since the first abort signal." "Get him on the phone." Dara handed her the phone without speaking. It was already ringing. He picked up on the second ring. "Are you clear of the building?" he said. No preamble. "Yes." "He took the drive, Kael." A silence. 1 second, 2. "Are you hurt?" "No." Another silence, different in texture. The kind of silence that contains a reckoning. "He let you get in," Kael said. It wasn't a question. "He watched the whole approach. He's known for 10 days. She pressed her back harder against the brick. "Someone in your inner structure gave him the plan. Not Reyes. Someone with access before Reyes' situation. Someone who's been there longer." She heard him breathing. Even, controlled, the kind of breath you maintain when something is tearing and you're holding the edges together with the force of your composure. "Come back to the warehouse," he said. "Kael." She stopped. Started again. "The arraignment is in 9 days. The evidence we needed was on that drive. Cleo's case is strong, but not strong enough without the original wire transfer authorization data, and you know that." She looked at the thin strip of winter sky visible above the alley. "We have nothing." "Not nothing," he said. "Tell me what we have that I don't know about." A pause that felt like a decision being made. "Come back," he said again quietly. "I'll tell you everything, not on the phone." She gave the phone back to Dara, closed her eyes for 3 seconds. The cold pressed against her neck, her hands, through the coat. She thought about the drive in Lazar's hand, closing around it with that efficient finality. She thought about the almost smile in the phrase "even more interesting," said by a man who collected information the way other people collected leverage and was currently deciding what to do with the information that Seraphina Vale had walked into his operation personally rather than sending a proxy. She thought about the leak, someone who had been there longer, someone who had been positioned inside Kael's organization for long enough to know about the server, the plan, the warehouse address, the safe houses, a catalog of information that required not just proximity, but trust. The shape of it was beginning to assemble in her mind the way that unwelcome patterns do. Slowly, and then all at once. She opened her eyes. "Let's go," she said. The warehouse was quiet when they arrived. Too quiet. She noticed it before she registered the reason for it. The absence of the background activity that usually populated the space, the reduced number of cars outside, the particular quality of stillness that means people have been sent away. Cale was alone in the main room, standing at the window the way he'd stood at the hotel window the first night, looking out at something only he could see, and he didn't turn when she came in. She stopped inside the door. "Where is everyone?" she said. "I sent them out." She looked at the room, at the table where the floor plans had been spread out, at the laptop Reyes had been using, now closed, at the chair where she'd sat for most of the past several days. "You already knew," she said. He turned from the window. His face was the same and not the same. The scar, the jaw, the careful eyes. But something in his expression had shifted from the careful management she'd come to read as his default mode into something raw and more specific. He looked like a man who had arrived at a conclusion he'd been trying to avoid for a long time. "I didn't know," he said. "I suspected. There's a difference, and it's an important one, because suspicion without evidence is how you destroy things that don't deserve destroying." He crossed to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat heavily in a way she'd never seen him sit. "I ran a trace on the information pathway over the last 12 hours. Who knew about the server plan? In what order? From what source?" She sat across from him. "And?" He placed a phone on the table. The screen showed a message thread. She turned the phone toward her and read it. The thread was short. 5 messages over 48 hours, sent from a number she didn't recognize to a contact saved only as V. The messages were in clipped coded language, references to the Vale approach, the 31st floor timeline, Draven's warehouse coordinate confirmation, and they ended with a message sent 14 hours ago. "Proceeding as discussed. She'll go in personally." The sending number was Dara's. The air in the room changed quality. Seraphina set the phone down on the table. She did not look up immediately. She looked at the phone and at the table's surface and at her own hands and felt the very specific texture of betrayal, not the hot, obliterating kind she'd felt with Damien, but something colder and more surgical, the kind that comes from losing trust in someone whose reliability you'd been using to replace your own. "Dara's been with you for how long?" she said. 7 years. "And she's been passing to Lazar for, based on the thread history I was able to recover, at least 14 months. He looked at the phone. "She wasn't selling the organization. I want to be precise about what she was doing. The information she passed was targeted, always related to external threats, never to internal operations. Someone helped Lazar map the threats to my operation, and Dara confirmed them." "Why would she do that?" "I don't know yet." His voice was flat with the effort of keeping it that way. "She's not here. I sent her out with the others because I needed to think before I talked to her." "You need to talk to her now," Seraphina said. "You need to know what she gave Lazar beyond the server plan. If he has safe house locations, I've already moved the critical assets." He looked at her. "As soon as the trace came back, I made 3 calls. It's handled." "What about Reyes' brother?" Something in his face compressed. "He's safe. That happened last night before the trace." He paused. "At least that part of it is clean." She looked at the phone again. The 5 messages. The 7 years preceding them that now had to be held up to different light. "She was in the room when you told me about the leak possibility," Seraphina said. "She was at the far end of the room, back to us." "Yes." "She heard." "Yes." A pause. She had been standing there for long enough that she heard the Lazar information, the leak question, and my acknowledgement that the warehouse address was compromised in the possibility. He looked at the table surface. "And this morning she drove you to the building herself." The full picture arrived in a single, nauseating moment of clarity. Dara had driven her to Mercer Tower. Dara had been 12 feet behind her in the lobby. Dara had handed her the phone in the alley and been already sending messages when she arrived at the alley entrance. "She confirmed to Lazar that I was going into the building personally," Seraphina said. "Yes." "Because if Lazar had me, he had leverage over you." "Yes." "She didn't think he'd hurt me." "I don't know what she thought." His voice had gone very quiet. "I'm telling you the operational fact. The intent I'm still—" He stopped, pressed his hand flat against the table surface and looked at it. 7 years, he said. and the sentence had a quality to it that she hadn't heard from him before. Not grief, exactly, because grief required softness, and this was harder than that. The feeling of a man discovering that a room he'd been standing in has no floor. A door opened at the far end of the warehouse space. Dara walked in. She looked at the two of them at the table, at the phone line between them, at the message thread visible on the screen, and she stopped walking. She was still wearing the coat from the morning. Her expression moved through a rapid, terrible sequence: recognition, calculation, and then a stillness that was the decision not to run. "Kael," she said. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Not at the table, at the chair against the wall, the one closest to the door, which was either a tactical choice or a psychological one, and Seraphina couldn't tell which. "How much did you give him?" Kael said. "Nothing that got anyone killed," Dara said. Her voice was even. She had the composure of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for a long time, which was itself a kind of answer. "That's not what I asked. 14 months ago, Lazar approached me through an intermediary." She looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "He said he had information about the subway fire, the one with Mira." The room went completely still. Seraphina watched Kael's face. "He said the fire wasn't an electrical fault," Dara continued. "He said it was set, and he said he had the documentation to prove who ordered it and why, and that if I wanted Kael to have it, I could earn it." She paused. "I didn't believe him at first. Then he showed me a partial document, the kind that's convincing enough that you can't unknow it once you've seen it." Another pause. "I told myself I was managing the exposure, giving him enough to keep him satisfied without compromising the core." "The subway fire was 14 years ago," Kael said. His voice had not changed in volume. It had changed in temperature, dropping past the level she'd heard him use for anything before. "Mira was 17 bucks. Yes. You've known for 14 months that it might not have been an accident. I wasn't certain. And you said nothing." The sentence sat in the room between them and didn't dissipate. Dara looked at Kael with the expression of someone who has made a calculation that felt rational at every step and has just arrived at the full cost of the arithmetic. "I was trying to get you the proof," she said. "I needed enough of Lazar's trust to—" "Did you get it?" His voice had dropped further. Seraphina was sitting very still. "No," Dara said. "He moved the documentation each time I got close. That's what he does. He holds the evidence and makes you keep earning it, and the evidence never—" She stopped. Something shifted in her face that was not an expression she had likely shown in a professional context before. Something real and exhausted and afraid. "He was never going to give it to me. I know that now. I knew it 3 months ago, and I kept going because I didn't know how to stop without—" She looked at Seraphina. "Without what happened today happening." Seraphina looked at Dara, at the flat, trained competence she'd trusted for 6 weeks, at the person underneath it who had been running a private operation inside a private operation, motivated by a misguided loyalty that had the shape of love and the consequence of catastrophe. "Who ordered the fire?" Seraphina said. "What did Lazar tell you?" Dara looked at Kael, not asking permission, something more complicated than that. "Tell her," Kael said. "Lazar said the fire was commissioned as a warning," Dara said, to Kael. "In 2010, when he was still building the operation and there was a territorial dispute with a family that has since collapsed. The target wasn't Mira, she was collateral. The documentation Lazar claims to have contains the name of who gave the commission." She paused. "He told me it was someone who is still in this city, someone who has recently become—" She looked at Seraphina with an expression that was the closest thing to an apology the situation was going to produce. "Someone who has recently become relevant to the current situation." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. "Damien Mercer," Seraphina said. Dara said nothing, which was its own answer. Kael stood up from the table. He walked to the window, the same window he'd been standing at when she came in, and stood with his back to both of them, and she watched the line of his shoulders and the stillness of his hands and understood that she was watching a man absorb information that restructured the past 14 years of his life in a single sentence. Damien Mercer had commissioned a warning fire in 2010. His younger sister had nearly died in it. And for 14 years, the man who had built an empire partly around protecting that sister and repaying the debt of her survival had been married, for 4 years, to the woman who had saved her, without knowing that the husband was the one who had put her in danger. The architecture of it was so precise and so devastating that for a moment Seraphina couldn't breathe around the full shape of it. She looked at Dara. "He married me," she said, and her voice came out very quiet and completely flat. "Damien married me knowing who I was to Kyle, knowing what I'd done in that tunnel." Dara looked at the floor. "When did he find out about the debt?" Seraphina said. "When did Damien know that Kyle was—" "I don't know," Dara said. "Lazar has the documentation. What I was told—" "Stop." Seraphina held up her hand. The word came out with a sharpness that surprised her own ears. She sat with the silence for a moment, with the cold in the warehouse and the hum of the servers and Kyle's stillness at the window. And she let the full inventory of the past 4 years rearrange itself around the new central fact. Damien had chosen her, had found her, specifically, among everyone in Blackthorn City. He'd known about Kyle's debt, he'd known about the tunnel, he'd selected her as a weapon, the divorce, the frozen accounts, the forged documents, the public destruction. None of it was about protecting Mercer Industries. It was a message, a detonation designed to reach Kyle Draven through the person he'd been quietly protecting for 3 years. Hurt the woman, expose the connection, draw Kyle into the open. And it had worked. Because Kyle had come for her in the rain. She looked at the back of Kyle's head at the window and felt something tear loose inside her chest. Not the clean grief of loss, but something more jagged. She had walked into this city's darkest room because she'd had nowhere else to go, and the man who'd opened the door had been sincere, had been genuinely in debt to her, and had also, without knowing it, without intending it, been the reason she'd been selected as a tool in the first place. She wasn't collateral. She had been the point. "Kyle," she said. He turned from the window. His face had the quality she'd first seen in the hotel corridor, controlled, precise, every surface deliberately managed. But his eyes were different. Something in his eyes had come undone, not the control. The control was still there, layered over everything the way it always was, built so deep it was structural rather than performed. But underneath it, visible only because she'd spent enough time in close proximity to him to know what his neutral looked like, was something exposed and raw. The specific anguish of a man who has just understood that the thing he built his life around protecting was damaged by the same hand he'd been preparing to destroy, and that the woman sitting across from him had been the instrument of both. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was as quiet as she'd ever heard it. "I know you didn't," she said. "If I had known—" "I know." The sentence closed between them. Not forgiveness. There was nothing to forgive, which was its own complicated grief. Just the acknowledgement that the architecture of what Damien had done was precise enough to have worked on both of them simultaneously, and that recognizing the precision didn't make it hurt less. Seraphina stood up from the table. Her legs were steady. She was mildly surprised by this. "We need to talk about what we're going to do," she said. "Tonight. Not tomorrow." Kyle looked at her. "Lazar has the drive," she said. "Dara's cover is gone. The arraignment is in 9 days, and our primary evidence pathway is compromised. Damien knows we came for the server because Lazar will tell him." She counted it out, flat and clinical, because the clinical register was the only one she could operate in right now without the thing in her chest breaking all the way through. "He's going to accelerate. If he's planning to run, it happens in the next 72 hours. Kyle straightened. The raw thing in his eyes receded behind the operational layer, not gone, but managed, like a fire with the oxygen reduced to what's strictly necessary for it to keep burning. He looked at Dara. "You're going to tell me everything Lazar said about the documentation," he said. "Every word, every meeting, every intermediary. Tonight." Dara nodded. "And then," he said, "you're going to help us get it back." The plan that assembled itself over the next 4 hours was not elegant. It was the kind of plan you build when the elegant version has already been burned and you're working with what the fire left behind. Fragments of operational capacity, compromised personnel, a 9-day deadline, and a leverage point that existed entirely because Victor Lazar believed he had won the afternoon. He had won the afternoon. That was the starting point Seraphina kept returning to, because underestimating what had happened would be fatal. Lazar had the drive. He had the documentation about the subway fire. He had watched their approach with the patience of a man who collects other people's desperation as currency and had emerged from the day with more than he'd entered it. He was, by any accounting, ahead. The question was whether being ahead had made him comfortable. Comfortable men made assumptions. Cleo Marsh arrived at the warehouse at 9 p.m. with dark circles under her eyes and a tablet full of documents and the expression of someone who had been doing triage on a case she'd spent a decade building and was not interested in receiving bad news without also receiving a path through it. Seraphina laid out the situation in 12 minutes, precise and complete. Cleo listened without interrupting, which was one of her best qualities. When Seraphina finished, Cleo was quiet for a moment. "The wire transfer authorization data," she said. "If Lazar has the physical drive, the data exists on that drive and the original server. We no longer have access to the server." "Correct. Can we reconstruct the evidentiary value from the secondary documentation we already have?" "Partially," Seraphina said. "Enough to establish the pattern, not enough to prove direct authorization in a federal courtroom against a defense team with unlimited resources." Cleo tapped the tablet against her palm. "Then we need a confession." The room absorbed this. "Not a voluntary one," Cleo continued, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for all her most incendiary statements. "A documented one. Damian Mercer has been making calls. His attorney is scrambling, his CFO is cooperating with investigators, and he is, based on the intercepts your people have provided, genuinely panicking. Panicking men talk. Specifically, they talk to the people they think are still on their side." She looked at Kael. "Who does he currently believe is on his side?" "Lazar," Kael said. "And does Lazar currently have any incentive to remain on Damian's side now that he's retrieved the drive and the value of the initial arrangement has been fulfilled?" Kael looked at Seraphina. She understood what Cleo was building toward a half-second before it fully formed, and the shape of it was dangerous and precise and terrible in the specific way that only good plans are terrible, because good plans require you to use real things as instruments. "Lazar wants Kael's operation," Seraphina said slowly. "The arrangement with Damian was never about protecting Damian. It was about using Damian's legal crisis as cover to position against Kael's territories while Kael was distracted." She looked at Kael. "Lazar doesn't need Damian anymore. Damian's value to him ends the moment the federal case makes him too dangerous to be adjacent to. Which means," Kael said, "that Damian is currently one public development away from becoming a liability that Lazar will want to distance himself from." "We give Lazar that development," Seraphina said. "We give him a reason to cut Damian loose. And when Damian realizes Lazar has abandoned him, he calls the one person he thinks he can still use." "His attorney," Cleo said. "No," Seraphina said. "He calls me." The silence that followed had the quality of people calculating simultaneously. "He'll call you to offer a deal," Cleo said carefully. "Off record. He'll want to negotiate what you know and what you're willing to do with it in exchange for something. Money, relocation resources, help disappearing." Seraphina looked at the table. "He's done it before. He managed 2 former employees out of the country when they became inconvenient. He'll think I can be managed the same way. He'll think I'm desperate enough." She paused. "He's not entirely wrong about the desperation. He's wrong about the direction of it." She looked at Cleo. "Can you record a phone call in a way that's admissible in Blackthorn jurisdiction?" "Under a single-party consent law, yes. With the right documentation of the setup, yes." Cleo had already opened a new document on her tablet. "I'll need 24 hours to prepare the legal framework." "You have 18, Seraphina said. Kael was watching her with an expression she'd seen once before. During the first conversation in the hotel, when she told him she knew about the Cayman LLC and the forged signatures and the appendicitis timeline, the expression of a man recalibrating. "You're using yourself as bait," he said. "I'm using myself as a closing argument," she said. "There's a difference." "He tried to destroy you in front of the entire city." "Yes." "Which means he underestimated what that would make me." She met Kael's eyes. Let me do this. He didn't look away. If something goes wrong, then something goes wrong and we deal with it. She kept her voice level. This is the play we have. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you the plan. A beat. Something moved across his face. Not defeat, not surrender. The specific expression of a man who recognizes that the woman across from him has become something he can't protect from the front anymore because she's already moved past him. All right, he said. The 18 hours that followed were the most compressed of her life. Cleo built the legal architecture. Reyes, reinstated to operational capacity with the condition of full transparency, a condition she met without complaint, worked on the mechanism to surface a damaging public development that would spook Lazar into cutting his arrangement with Damien. Kael's network moved the remaining safehouse assets and restructured the communication protocols that Dara had compromised, a process that was cold and systematic, and that Seraphina could see was costing him something specific that he wasn't going to name. Dara herself worked alongside Reyes with the focused, self-punishing efficiency of someone doing penance through labor. Seraphina watched her once from across the room and felt something complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the recognition that Dara's mistake had been built from something real, from 7 years of loyalty misdirected through 14 months of manipulation, and that the shape of a mistake didn't tell you everything about the person who made it. At 4 a.m., she found Kael in the small side room off the main warehouse floor that served as the closest thing the space had to a private office. A desk, a lamp, a window looking at a brick wall. He was reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in. You should sleep, he said. So should you. He set the phone down. Tell me what you need. She sat on the edge of the desk. I need to know the subway fire isn't going to break you open during the next 36 hours. He was quiet. Because I need you operational, she said. Completely. Not half operational with the other half somewhere 14 years ago. She looked at him directly. Can you do that? Yes, he said, and then more quietly. I've been angry about that fire since 2010. I've just been angry at the wrong source. Something moved in his jaw. Knowing the right source doesn't make it harder to function. It makes it simpler. Simpler isn't always safer. No, he agreed, but it's cleaner. She looked at his hands on the desk, the thick knuckles, the old scars. She thought about him sitting 3 tables away at a charity benefit watching Damien's hand on her arm, and the photograph tucked in a leather journal, and the 7 words in the rain. I finally found you again. She had not let herself think too carefully about those 7 words since the night he'd said them, because there was too much else to think about, and because the feeling they produced was not something she had the structural capacity to handle during an active operational crisis. But sitting on the edge of his desk at 4 in the morning with 36 hours left on a 9-day clock, she let herself feel it briefly. After this is over, she said. He looked at her. I'm not saying it now because now is the wrong time, she said. But after. He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. Not a grab, not a press. Just the weight of his hand on top of hers, very still for about 5 seconds. Then he took it away. After, he said. She went and slept for 3 hours. The public development that forced Lazar's hand hit every major media outlet in Blackthorn City at 9:47 a.m. A federal subpoena for Lazar Security Services, LLC, issued in connection with the Mercer Industries investigation, sourced anonymously and worded in a way that directly implicated the company in the obstruction of evidence recovery. The subpoena was real. Cleo had leveraged a contact in the federal prosecutor's office who had his own reasons to be interested in anything adjacent to Mercer Industries. The specific wording about evidence obstruction was a characterization that Cleo had ensured was included, and which was specific enough to make Lazar's adjacency to Damien a legal hazard rather than just a reputational one. By 11 a.m., Lazar's attorney had filed a statement distancing the company from the Mercer case. By 12:30, one of Kael's contacts reported that Lazar had left a meeting at Mercer Tower without completing it. At 1:14 p.m., Seraphina's phone rang. She looked at the number. She'd memorized Damien's personal cell, the one he used for calls he didn't want on record, 4 years ago and had never deleted it because the memory was automatic. She let it ring twice, controlled her breathing, pressed record on the device Cleo had prepared. "Damien," she said. His voice on the line sounded like a man standing at the edge of something, tightly controlled at the surface and hollow underneath, the specific acoustic quality of a person who has been holding a performance together through will alone and can hear the will starting to crack. "I need to talk to you," he said. "You're talking to me." "Not on the phone. In person. Tonight." "Why would I meet you in person?" A pause. "Because I have something you want, and you have something I need, and this ends better for both of us if we resolve it directly." She let the silence sit for a full 3 seconds, long enough for him to feel it. "Where?" she said. He named Mercer Tower. The top floor, the executive penthouse that hadn't been occupied since the board had suspended his access, which meant he still had a key and was using this as a statement of something. Control. Possession. The claim of a man who'd built a building and believed that made it his even as it fell. 9 p.m., he said. 9 p.m., she agreed. She ended the call and looked at Cleo, who was sitting 3 feet away with headphones and a recording monitor and the expression of someone who has just watched a long bet begin to pay out. "Clean recording," Cleo said. "Crystal." "He wants something I have," Seraphina said. "What does he think I have that he needs?" "Evidence he hasn't found yet," Cleo said. "He doesn't know exactly what you retrieved before Lazar took the drive. He'll have assumed you completed the transfer, which means he thinks a copy of the authorization data exists somewhere he hasn't located." She paused. "He wants to know where it is so he can destroy it or buy it. And Lazar hasn't told him the drive is empty." "Lazar has no incentive to tell him the drive is empty. If Damien thinks the drive contains what we wanted him to think, it has value to Lazar as leverage over Damien, regardless of whether the actual data is on it." Seraphina absorbed this. "So Lazar kept the drive as a bargaining chip over Damien, even though it's useless to us." "Correct." "Which means Damien believes I have a copy of data that could destroy him." "Yes." "And he's going to offer me money to give it up." "Or to disappear," Cleo said. "He has the resources for both options, and he'll present whichever one he thinks you'll accept. Either way, what he says on tape to get there is a confession," Seraphina said, "of everything he thinks I might know." "That's the theory." She looked at Kael across the room. "He'll have security," Kael said. "He'll have 2 or 3 people," she said. "Damien doesn't move with a large detail because he believes a large detail signals fear. He'll have the ones he trusts most." She paused. "Which means he'll have the ones Lazar hasn't already pulled. I want people on every floor below the penthouse." "You'll have them," Reyes said from the corner. "And I want a clean exit route that doesn't depend on the elevators. Service stairwell on the north side. Phillips, the lobby guard, is ours. He called in this morning after the Lazar situation went public. He's been uncomfortable for weeks." Seraphina nodded. She was running the entry, the room configuration, the conversation she was going to have to sustain for long enough to get what they needed. She was running Damien's psychology, the specific way panic expressed itself in him, the tells she'd learned in 4 years of sharing space with him, the micro-acceleration in his speech when he was lying, the way his left hand moved to his jacket lapel when he was calculating an exit, the precise register his voice dropped to when he was making an offer he considered beneath him but was making anyway. She knew him. That was the one advantage he'd given her without intending to, 4 years of intimate observation, filed away by a precise memory that she'd never fully turned off. She spent the afternoon going through it systematically. Every relevant document she'd memorized, every financial anomaly she'd photographed, every conversation she'd overheard or been part of that she'd stored without knowing why. She pulled it forward and organized it, and Cleo listened and noted and refined the list of statements they needed Damien to make on record. At 6 p.m., Kael found her in the side room. "Eat something," he said. She ate. She wasn't hungry, but she ate because she understood the operational logic. You fuel the body before a long run, regardless of whether the body is asking for it. At 7:30, she changed into clothes that were not the coat from the morning, that were dark and well-fitted, and that felt like the version of herself she'd been assembling over the past weeks, rather than the version she'd been before any of this started. She stood in front of the small mirror on the warehouse bathroom wall and looked at her own face. She didn't look broken. That was the first thing she checked. She looked tired, the real grained tiredness of someone who had slept in 3-hour blocks and run on adrenaline and anger for most of a month, but not broken. Her eyes were clear and hard and specific in a way she didn't fully recognize, the way you don't always recognize the faces you grow into until you're standing directly in front of them. Kyle was at the door of the warehouse when she came out. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he reached up and adjusted the collar of her jacket. A small, precise gesture that was not a touch so much as a correction. The instinctive act of someone who paid attention to details and couldn't help paying attention. "Don't let him make it personal," he said. "It's already personal," she said. "Don't let him use that." His eyes were level on hers. "He's going to try to make you react. The moment you react emotionally, the tape gets complicated. You're a witness, not a participant." "I know." "I'll be on the 32nd floor," he said. "The moment the recording is complete, Reyes will signal and we move." "I know," she said again. She stepped past him toward the car. The drive to Mercer Tower took 11 minutes in light evening traffic. She spent it looking out the window at the city, the light bouncing off wet pavement, the pedestrians moving under streetlights, the vertical lines of glass towers against a sky that was the specific dark blue of winter, early evening. She'd lived in this city for 31 years. She knew the way it looked from penthouse windows and from rain-soaked courthouse steps and from the back of a black car. And she'd learned recently that the view wasn't the measure of the thing, that a city was what you built inside it and who you built it with and whether what you built could hold you when everything else came down. The lobby of Mercer Tower at 9 p.m. was nearly empty. Phillips was at the security desk and he met her eyes briefly as she crossed the marble floor toward the elevator bank, a fractional nod that meant what it was supposed to mean. The elevator was already called. She stepped in. The penthouse floor was dark except for the city lights pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows on all 4 sides. 40 stories of glass and Blackthorn below, the harbor in the south, the financial district in the north, a lightning storm building over the water to the east that lit the horizon in slow, irregular pulses. Damien was standing at the east window. He turned when she stepped out of the elevator. He looked like 3 weeks of controlled disintegration. The suit still good, the hair still managed, but the details wrong in ways that would only be visible to someone who knew what right looked like. The collar was too tight. There were shadows under his eyes that concealer hadn't fully addressed. His hands were in his pockets, which was the posture he used when he needed to stop them from doing something visible. "Seraphina," he said. "Damien," she said. She walked toward the center of the room slowly, taking the space the way you take the space in a room you're not afraid of. She stopped 15 feet from him, near the long executive table that was the only furniture on the unfinished floor. The renovation had halted with the financial crisis, leaving the space raw and industrial-edged under the glass exterior. He looked at her the way you look at someone you once thought you fully understood and have since revised. "You look different," he said. "I am different," she said. "You've been living in Draven's world for a month." He said it with the specific curl of a man who needs contempt to feel stable. "What does that make you?" "Someone who knows what she has and how to use it," she said. His jaw moved. "You have a copy of the server data." "I have several things," she said neutrally. "I want to resolve this privately." He took a step toward her, stopped. "The federal case? I can have Pruitt's involvement unwound. The fraud referral can be dropped. I have enough relationships left but... Stop," she said. He stopped. "I'm not here to negotiate the federal case," she said. "I'm here because you called me. So tell me what you actually want." Something shifted in his expression, the social management slipping slightly to show the animal urgency underneath it. "The server data. Whatever you pulled from the 31st floor, I need it gone." "Why?" "Because it contains..." He stopped, recalibrated. "Because it's sensitive." "Be specific," she said. He looked at her. She could see him calculating. How much to give her, what the minimum disclosure was that would get him what he needed, the exact dosage of honesty that would close the deal without exposing too much. It was a calculation she'd watched him run in boardrooms and at dinner tables and in their own bedroom when she'd ask questions she wasn't supposed to ask, and she knew what it looked like from every angle. The transfer authorizations, he said. The wire transfers from the company accounts. My direct authorizations. The ones you attributed to me. His jaw tightened. The ones under your name. Your authorizations, she said. Your signature. Your instruction. Seraphina, say it, she said. I need to hear you say exactly what's on that server, Damien, so we both know we're talking about the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the divorce table, through her, calculating. And then something in that look changed, because she was not the same person who had signed those papers. And even through his panic, he could see that, and the recalibration showed in his face. There are authorization documents on that server that have my direct signature on every transaction we attributed to you, he said. Personal instructions to route the transfers through your accounts. Dated, timed, complete. A pause. If those surface in federal court, you go to prison, she said. Yes. For how long? He said nothing. Damien, she said quietly. How long? 15 years minimum, he said. Possibly 20, with the fraud enhancement. She stood in the dark penthouse with the lightning building over the harbor, and Damien Mercer's voice on a live recording saying the words that Cleo needed, and she felt not triumph, but something quieter and more durable. The specific relief of a structure finally bearing the weight it was built to hold. There's something else on that server, she said. He went still. The Lazar security contract, she said. The timeline of when it was initiated. She watched his face. And communications about a consulting arrangement with Lazar Security that predates the security contract by approximately 3 years. The color shifted in his face. Not much. Enough. I don't know what you... 2010, she said. A consulting arrangement. A specific project. A specific location. She let the pause sit. A specific target that wasn't the target that was hit. His hands came out of his pockets. She saw his right hand move toward his jacket, and she saw it clearly and precisely, and she understood in the same instant that what he was reaching for was not his phone, and not his lapel, and not anything she'd factored into the risk calculation, because she'd known Damien Mercer for 5 years and had never once seen him carry a weapon. The shot was loud in the empty penthouse, not from Damien's hand, from behind her. The glass in the east window, 40 stories of floor-to-ceiling city view, exploded inward as Victor Lazar's man came through it from the exterior maintenance platform, and the impact of the gunshot simultaneously dropped one of Damien's security detail from the hallway entrance, and Seraphina hit the floor on instinct, rolling behind the executive table as a second shot rang from somewhere below, and the lights cut out completely, and the penthouse became a space of lightning-lit darkness, and the sound of... The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Then the emergency lighting kicked in. Low, red-orange, the color of something burning at the edge of vision. And Seraphina was already moving, flat against the underside of the executive table, with her cheek against the cold concrete floor, and the sound of broken glass still settling around her, and a man's voice shouting in a language she didn't recognize from somewhere near the hallway entrance. She counted what she knew. One of Damien's security people was down. She'd heard the shot and the fall and the specific silence that followed. Lazar's man had come through the east window from the exterior platform, which meant there was a second team operating outside the building. Kael's people were on 32. The stairwell was on the north side. The recording device was still running in her jacket pocket because she hadn't touched it, and the impact of hitting the floor hadn't been hard enough to damage it. She needed 30 more seconds of Damien's voice. She raised her head above the table edge. Damien was against the south window, backed into the corner where the glass met the frame, and he had the weapon now. A compact handgun that looked wrong in his hands, the way tools look wrong when used by people who've only ever owned them for the idea of ownership. He was pointing it at the room in general, at the darkness and the moving shapes within it, and his breathing was audible from 15 feet away. Lazar's man had taken cover behind the elevator bank. She could see the outline of him in the emergency lighting. Crouched, professional, not moving yet, establishing position. "Damien," she said. He swung the gun toward the table. "It's me," she said. "I'm behind the table. Don't shoot at the table." A short, ragged exhale from his direction. "Lazar sent someone," she said. "That's what's happening right now. He cut you loose this morning, and tonight he sent someone to make sure you can't talk to federal investigators." She kept her voice level and continuous, the kind of voice you use in a room with a frightened animal. No sudden movements in the sound. "The only way out of this building that doesn't end with you in a bag is if Kael's people get up here first. And the only reason Kael's people come up here and not Lazar's additional team from the stairwell is if I signal them, which I will do. But I need you to say one more thing on record." Silence. "Damien," she paused. "The subway fire. 2010. Say what you paid for." "You're insane," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that confirmed he understood exactly what she was asking. "Say it," she said. "Say it, and I call Kael's people up here, and Lazar's man doesn't get to finish what he came to do. Don't say it, and I stay behind this table, and you handle the next 60 seconds alone." A sound from Lazar's man near the elevator bank. Weight shifting. Preparation. He wasn't waiting much longer. "It wasn't supposed to be anyone," Damien said. His voice had gone strange. Not the managed register, not the performed grief, not the boardroom tone. Something underneath all of it that might have been, in a different life and a different man, something resembling the truth. It was a warning for Draven. There wasn't supposed to be anyone in that carriage. But there was. There was a girl. The words came out rough and without architecture, the way things come out when the structure collapses. She was 17. It wasn't the plan. "You paid for it anyway." "I paid for the fire, not for—" He stopped. "Say the rest." "I paid Victor Lazar's predecessor to set the fire as a territorial warning. I didn't ask about casualties. I didn't check." A pause that contained something that might have been the ghost of remorse, long dead, dried out, barely recognizable. "I didn't check." Seraphina closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she pulled out her phone and sent the signal. She heard the stairwell door on the north side open 17 seconds later. Multiple sets of feet, fast and coordinated. Lazar's man heard it too and made his calculation in real time. The math of 2 against unknown, in a space that had just become hostile, without the backup that should have already arrived from the level below. She heard him move toward the blown-out east window, toward the exterior platform and the descent route. And then she heard a second set of sounds from that direction that told her the exterior route was also covered, had been covered, that Reyes had anticipated the platform approach and put people on the maintenance scaffolding before the meeting started. What followed was loud and brief. She stayed behind the table. When it was over, when the sounds resolved into footsteps and voices she recognized and the particular quality of a room that has stopped being a battlefield and started being a crime scene, she stood up. Reyes was at the elevator bank. 2 of Kael's people were securing Lazar's man, who was alive and would remain alive because alive was more useful than the alternative. Phillips was at the stairwell door, out of his depth and handling it with the rigid composure of a man who'd made a decision about which side he was on and was committed to living with the consequences. Damien was still against the south window. He hadn't fired the weapon. He was holding it at his side now, pointed at the floor, with the posture of a man who has run out of options in every direction simultaneously. When he saw Seraphina stand up from behind the table, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the contempt, not the management, not the almost smile. Something stripped and hollow and raw. "It's over," she said. He looked at the gun in his hand, at the room, at the lightning still moving over the harbor through the broken east window, slow and indifferent. He set the gun on the floor. Reyes moved forward and had it in a single smooth motion, gloves on, clean chain of evidence, the kind of competence that comes from practice in situations most people don't survive long enough to practice. Seraphina looked at Damien Mercer, at the man she had loved for a year and endured for 3 more, at the man who had selected her with calculation and married her with strategy and dismantled her with legal instruments and set a fire 14 years ago that should have killed a 17-year-old girl, at the man who had been afraid of her for months without understanding why, and who now understood completely. She didn't feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more permanent, the specific completion of a thing that has been unfinished for a long time, like a sentence arriving at its period after too many clauses. "The recording is clean," she said to Reyes. "All of it." "I know," Reyes said. "I've been monitoring from 32. She looked back at Damien. "Federal agents are going to come through that stairwell door in approximately 4 minutes. That's how long you have to decide whether you cooperate or you don't." She paused. "I'd recommend cooperating. Cleo Marsh will tell you the same thing, but she'll charge you for the advice." He said nothing. He was looking at the floor, at the gun no longer in his hand, at the city through the broken window. She turned and walked toward the stairwell. She was at the door when he spoke. "Did you know?" he said. "When you married me. Did you know any of it?" She stopped, considered the question and what it was actually asking, whether she'd been complicit, whether the whole thing had been a counter-operation, whether she was a different kind of instrument than he'd believed. "No," she said. "I loved you. For a while." She looked at the door handle. "That's the worst part of it, for me, that I did, and you knew, and you used it anyway." She pushed through the door. The stairwell was concrete and cold and lit by emergency strips along the edges of each step, and she went down 2 flights before her legs registered what they'd been doing for the last 40 minutes, and she sat on a step landing and put her back against the wall and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them with detached interest, the fine tremor that comes after sustained adrenaline, the body's debit collection on the loan of the last hour. She let them shake. It was honest. She heard footsteps on the stairs above her, coming down, and she knew from the sound before she saw him. Kyle sat on the step beside her, not across from her, not standing over her. Beside her, on the same cold concrete step, close enough that his arm was against hers. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They sat there while the building moved around them, the sounds of federal agents arriving in the lobby, of radio communication through the stairwell walls, of a situation becoming a record, evidence bagged and documented, the long bureaucratic machinery of consequence grinding into motion. After a while, she said, "He confessed to the fire." "I know," Kyle said. "Reyes had the feed." "It's on the recording." "Yes." Another silence. She looked at the wall across from her. Concrete, unpainted, functional. "He said there wasn't supposed to be anyone in the carriage," she said. Kyle was quiet. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse," she said. "Worse," he said. "Not bitter, just precise. Better would be if he'd known and stopped it. Not knowing and not checking is just a different kind of choosing." She looked at his profile in the emergency lighting, the scar, the jaw, the specific quality of stillness he carried that she'd spent weeks learning to read and still didn't fully have the vocabulary for. "Mira doesn't know about any of this," she said. "No. She's going to need to." "I know." He turned his head and looked at her directly. "I'll tell her. Not tonight." "Not tonight," she agreed. He put his hand over hers on the step between them. Not the brief, careful gesture from the desk at 4 a.m, something more settled than that. Something that didn't ask a question or make a case, that simply existed and held its own weight. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that until the sounds above them changed in pitch, the specific shift that meant Damien Mercer was being walked out of a room in handcuffs. And then they stood up and went back into the world. The weeks that followed had their own particular texture, different from the compressed urgency that had preceded them. The machinery of consequence moved at the pace of institutions, which was to say slowly, formally, and with a great deal of paperwork, but it moved. The recording from the penthouse was delivered to Cleo Marsh at 8 the following morning and to the federal prosecutor's office by noon. The prosecutor was not Calvin Pruitt, who had been quietly removed from the case following a separate inquiry into his relationship with the Mercer family's general counsel, an inquiry that had been initiated by a complaint Cleo had been preparing for 6 weeks and filed the same morning. The new prosecutor was a woman named Adkins, who had a reputation for following evidence wherever it led and a personal distaste for cases that had been managed. Damien was arraigned 48 hours after the penthouse. He entered a not guilty plea that no one in the courtroom, including his attorney, seemed to believe was sustainable. The recording, the server data, recovered from a secondary backup that Reyes had quietly maintained, a contingency never discussed with the full team because Reyes had learned from 14 months of being managed by someone else to keep her own insurance, and the forensic accounting that Cleo's team had assembled over 8 weeks created an evidentiary architecture that Damien's legal team spent 2 days examining before recommending that their client reconsider his plea. He reconsidered it. The cooperation agreement took 3 weeks to negotiate and covered everything: the Cayman accounts, the forged documents, the Lazar arrangement, the commission of the subway fire in 2010, the federal sentencing guidelines on the combined charges, even with cooperation, were not gentle. Damien Mercer received 18 years. He was 53 years old when he was sentenced. Seraphina did the math once and then put it down and didn't pick it up again. Victor Lazar's situation was more complex and took longer. The evidence from the recording about his predecessor's role in the 2010 fire, combined with a federal investigation into Lazar Security Services that the subpoena had formally opened, created a legal exposure that Lazar spent 6 weeks attempting to manage through intermediaries before concluding that the management cost exceeded the benefit. His cooperation agreement, negotiated separately from Damien's, produced a different kind of outcome: reduced charges in exchange for the documentation about the subway fire, which had been real all along, and for the naming of 2 sitting city officials who had been accepting payment from the syndicate for 8 years. The Lazar organization didn't collapse cleanly, nothing like it ever does, but without leadership and with its financial infrastructure frozen, it contracted, and the territories it had been attempting to absorb from Kael's operation were absorbed instead in the other direction, quietly, in the methodical way that Kyle Draven did most things. Celeste Arden's involvement in the Mercer financial fraud was peripheral enough that her attorney negotiated a civil settlement rather than criminal charges, a settlement that included the return of assets transferred to her name during the marriage, a process that produced one afternoon of genuinely satisfying paperwork that Seraphina signed in Cleo's office with a pen she kept afterward. Harriet Solis, caught between her own conflict of interest exposure and the collapse of the client whose legal strategy she'd built her past 2 years around, resigned from her firm and relocated. Seraphina had no particular feeling about this. There was a limit to how much energy she was willing to spend on people who had been instruments rather than architects. Torrance Hale, who had been frightened of Seraphina for 6 months because he'd known what was coming and known she was in the middle of it and hadn't known which way to run, testified fully and cooperated fully and received the consideration his attorney had sought from the beginning. He sent her a card afterward. She didn't open it for 2 weeks, and when she did, it said only, "I should have told you sooner." She didn't disagree with that. Dara left Kael's operation. This was not a dismissal and not entirely voluntary. It was the kind of departure that happens when both parties understand that the terms of a working relationship have been permanently altered by what happened within it, and that attempting to maintain the relationship in its previous form would cost more than ending it cleanly. Dara's brother Marcus was alive and out of Lazar's facility and living in a different city. That was the full accounting of what her 14 months had purchased. She seemed to understand this. She left without a scene, which was consistent with everything Seraphina knew about her. Reyes stayed. She rebuilt the communication protocols, restructured the operational security, and ran her corner of the organization with the focused intensity of someone paying a debt through the quality of their work. Seraphina understood this because it was the same mechanism she'd used, the specific way trauma can be metabolized into competence if you're disciplined enough and if the work is worth doing. She wasn't sure yet that Kael's work was entirely worth doing, in all its dimensions. She was sure enough in enough of its dimensions that she could be present for it with her eyes open, which was the bar she'd set for herself after the penthouse. She and Kael did not have a conversation about what they were, exactly, for a long time. The city had a way of filling time with necessity, and they were both people who existed more comfortably in action than in declaration, and there was a tacit understanding between them, unspoken, clearly held by both, that what was between them would be named when it was ready to be named and not before. What she knew in the meantime was practical and concrete. She knew how he took his coffee, which was black and not too hot because he'd burned his tongue badly once, and the preference had stuck. She knew that he slept lightly and woke at 5 regardless of when he'd gone to bed. She knew the specific way he went quiet when something was worrying him that he hadn't fully processed, a quality of stillness slightly different from his operational stillness. And she'd learned to recognize it and to leave him with it rather than pressing, which was what he needed. She knew that he kept a photograph of Mira in the drawer of the desk in his private office. Not the harbor photograph. That one had been burned the night after the penthouse along with the leather journal it had been kept in. A small, deliberate ceremony that Kyle performed alone and that she didn't ask about. But a recent one, taken last summer, of a young woman with dark hair laughing at something outside the frame. She knew this because she'd seen it once by accident and had not mentioned it, and he had not mentioned it, and it was simply there in the office as a fact of the room, the way significant things are when they don't need to be explained. She told Mira about the tunnel in March. They met in a coffee shop that Mira chose. Small, not the kind of place people took meetings, the kind of place people went to actually drink coffee. Mira was 24 years old and studying architecture and had her brother's quality of stillness and her own quality of directness that was softer than his but equally present. She listened to what Seraphina said about the tunnel, the smoke, the service corridor, the wrist she'd pulled, and she was quiet for a long moment afterward. "I looked for you," Mira said. "Afterward. When I was well enough to look. The transit authority had a partial name, but the contact details were wrong." "I'd just moved," Seraphina said. "Married someone. Different address." Mira looked at her. Kyle looked too. For longer. "I know." Mira wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I used to think about you," she said. "The woman who pulled me out. I used to wonder what kind of person does that. Just pulls someone out of a fire and disappears. And now," she looked out the window at the street. "Now you're here." "Now I'm here," Seraphina agreed. Mira looked back at her with the direct, uncomplicated warmth of someone who has decided to feel what she feels without managing it for the comfort of others. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply. Something moved in Seraphina's chest. Not the gravel weight from the courthouse steps, not the compression that had lived behind her sternum for most of the past year. Something cleaner and less defended. "Me too," she said. Cleo Marsh opened a joint practice with Seraphina in April. This was Cleo's idea, advanced over 2 cups of coffee and a 3-page outline of projected caseload that she'd clearly been developing for some time. The practice focused on civil litigation on behalf of individuals, specifically those whose financial identities had been used against them, whose names appeared on documents they hadn't signed, whose paper trails had been constructed around them by people with more resources and less conscience. The first case was a woman in the East Side District who had been through a version of what Seraphina had been through, on a smaller scale, without the advantage of Kyle Draven's operational network or Cleo's forensic accounting skills. They won it in 6 weeks. The woman cried in the hallway outside the courtroom. Seraphina didn't cry. She shook the woman's hand and said, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when the asset transfer clears." And the woman laughed. And Cleo, walking past with her tablet, said, "Correct answer," without looking up. The office they chose was on the 14th floor of a building in the Civic District, 3 blocks from the courthouse. Not Mercer Towers District, a different part of the city, older architecture, the kind of building that had been built to last rather than to impress. The view was the harbor, which in winter was gray and austere, and in spring, when the ice cleared, was the specific blue of something that had survived. She was in that office on a Thursday evening in late April, working through a new case file with the window open and the sound of the harbor coming up through it, when her phone rang. Kyle. "Come to the penthouse," he said. Not Mercer Tower. His penthouse, the one in the Caldwell building that she'd gradually come to know as well as anywhere in the city, the one with the wide balcony and the city view in all 4 compass directions. "Now," she said. "When you're done," he said. "No rush." She finished the case file, locked the office, walked the 6 blocks to the Caldwell rather than taking a car, because the evening was mild in the particular way of late April in a city that has come through a hard winter, and she wanted to feel the pavement under her and the air on her face. The city looked the same as it always had, which was to say, it looked like itself. Complicated, lit, moving in all directions simultaneously, carrying its history in the depth of its streets and the height of its buildings and the faces of its people. She had known this city her whole life and had spent 4 years looking at it from the wrong height and the wrong angle, which was not the city's fault, but was the kind of mistake that looks obvious only afterward. She took the elevator to the top floor. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked when she was expected, which was Kyle's version of a standing invitation, issued without ceremony. He was on the balcony. The city spread below them in every direction, lit in the particular amber and white palette of a city at spring dusk. The harbor was still visible to the south, catching the last light. Music came from inside, jets, the slow kind. The kind that's not trying to do anything except exist in the same space as whatever else is happening. She leaned on the balcony railing beside him. He didn't speak immediately. He was looking at the northern district, at the cluster of towers that included Mercer Tower, now operating under a court-appointed administrator while the federal asset review proceeded. The building was still the tallest in that cluster. It would probably remain the tallest. Buildings didn't care who had built them. "Mira called me," he said. "I know. She texted me to tell me she was going to call you. She said you were good company." "I'm passable company," Seraphina said. "I didn't say anything awkward until the very end." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "What did you say at the end?" "I told her the coffee was bad and she should try the place on Meridian instead." He looked at her. "That's not awkward." She seemed to agree. She paused. "She's going to be fine, Kyle." He looked back at the city. "I know. She's already fine. She has been for a long time. You've been—" She stopped, chose the word carefully. "Delayed in seeing that." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been a lot of things I was delayed in seeing." The sentence sat between them, holding more than its surface weight. The 3 years of distance watching, the photograph in the journal, the 7 words in the rain, and everything that had followed and everything that had been paid for in the process of following it. She looked at his profile, the scar that she'd long since stopped seeing as interruption and now saw as architecture. The watch, the hands on the railing that were not soft and that she knew now from the inside as well as the outside, knew the warmth of them and the careful restraint that lived in them and the specific way they moved when he was thinking about something he hadn't decided to say yet. "You told me after," she said. He turned his head. "In the stairwell," she said. "You said after." His eyes were very steady on hers. "I remember." "It's after," she said. He turned from the railing to face her fully. The city went on behind him, doing what cities do, moving and breathing and holding the full inventory of its lives without comment. The music came through the open door. The last of the light settled into the harbor. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the car in the rain, with recognition, with something that had been waiting a long time to arrive at its object, and had arrived now and was not in any hurry to move on. "I know what I want," he said. "I've known for a long time. I wasn't sure what you—" "Kyle," she said. He stopped. "I walked into your car in the rain," she said. "I got in. I've been getting in, every decision since then. I think you can draw a conclusion from the pattern." Something in his face opened. Not the raw exposure from the warehouse, not the operational control, but something underneath both of those. The version of him that existed before either necessity. Unguarded. Present. He reached up and touched her face. Not the collar adjustment, not the careful over-the-desk gesture. His hand against her jaw, his thumb at her cheekbone. With the absolute stillness of someone who has learned to move through the world without wasting motion and is choosing to be still. "Seraphina," he said, and her name in his mouth was not a preamble to anything. It was the thing itself. She put her hand over his. The city moved below them, unhurried, indifferent to the specific shape of the moment on one balcony among 10,000 windows, the way cities are always indifferent to the individual moments that happen to be the most important. That indifference was not cruelty. It was just the scale of things. The city too large to notice, and the moment therefore belonging entirely to the people inside it. She thought briefly and without bitterness about the courthouse steps and the rain and the $63 in the bottom of her bag and the woman sleeping in a bathtub trying to feel temperature. She thought about Cleo's 2 cups of coffee and the case file open on her desk and Mira's hands around a coffee cup and Rhea's running damage control with the focused penance of someone who had decided to be better than her worst moment. She thought about the woman who'd cried in the hallway outside the courtroom and about the ones who would come after her and about the practice on the 14th floor with the harbor view and the good bones. She was 31 years old. She had a law degree she was using. She had a city she understood from every angle now, the height and the pavement and the dark and the lit, and she was standing on a balcony in the late spring dusk with her hand over the hand of the most dangerous man in it, and she was not afraid of any of that. She was, in the specific and durable sense of the word, not the easy sense, not the sense that came before difficulty, but the sense that came through it and out the other side and found that something was still standing. Fine. The jazz moved through the open door. The harbor caught the last light and gave it back. Kale's thumb moved once against her cheekbone. The small, unhurried gesture of someone who has arrived somewhere and recognizes it. And she turned her face slightly into his hand the way you turn toward warmth, instinctively, without deciding to. Below them, Blackthorn City carried on. And on the balcony, in the quiet that had finally become available to them, the 2 people who had spent a decade finding their way to the same place let the night come in without hurrying it. Some debts, when they're paid in full, don't disappear. They change shape. They become something you carry differently, not as weight, but as record. Evidence of what you survived and who survived it with you, written into the body the way scars are written, permanent and honest and no longer, after enough time, painful to touch. Seraphina Vale had once signed her name on a line she hadn't chosen, in a room full of cameras, with nowhere left to go. She had gone somewhere. She was still going. That was enough. That was, in the end, what enough looked like, and not triumph, not the clean resolution of narrative, but the ordinary and extraordinary fact of a person still present in her own life, still choosing, still standing at the edge of the next thing without flinching. The city lights came on as the last of the dusk went out, and Seraphina, for the first time in a very long time, did not look at them and feel anything other than what they were, just lights, in a city, on a night that was hers.